everybody, and welcome to the panel today, which is on contaminated sites and reconciliation. We're super excited to have you here today. I'm your moderator, Tanya Shanoff, and we have a fantastic panel who we'll introduce soon to you to talk today about our really interesting discussion around what reconciliation means in the context of contaminated sites. Before we start our discussion in earnest, I would like to ask Kira Portress, who's one of our panel members, to please provide us with a land acknowledgement. Kira, over to you.
Thank you, Tanya. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Haida people and the Haida Nation. So that's where I'm located today. I'm have the honor of being a guest in this territory for about the next week until I return to Lekwung territory after that, where I work and play every day. But also recognizing that this is, a national conference, and many of us and many of the participants are joining us from elsewhere in Canada. That Canada wasn't always known as Canada. It's now known as Canada, and I would really like to challenge everyone here to take the time to understand and study the traditional territories that they're in, if they're treaty territories or if they're unceded or ceded, and what kind of treaties are there, because not all treaties are made the same. So I'm really happy to be working in this area, and also really happy to be part of this panel. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kier. Really appreciate that as the roll into our great discussion today. So just so folks are aware, we have a panel discussion today. We're going to start off with some introductions from each of the panel members for a couple of minutes to talk to us about their feelings around reconciliation in the context of contaminated sites. Then we're going to roll into some prepared questions we have for some of the pairs of the panel members to discuss some of the key topics and issues we've been thinking about and chatting about. And then I'm going to open it for some questions from the crowd. We have about 250 people that are participating right now, which is fantastic. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you have a question for the panel as we roll into that open forum. And then we'll have a close. So let's get rolling. I'm going to start off with Dale Booth, who is coming to us from near Ottawa, Ontario. Dale, it is your introduction. You have 2 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you so much. My name is Dale Booth. I am the Executive Director of Operations for the community of Pikwakanagan, and I'm also the owner of a business named Innovation 7 and Links Totem Construction. I'm looking forward to this discussion today because, when we talk about cleaning up of contaminated sites, we're talking about cleaning up. That's kind of what we're doing when we're talking about reconciliation. We're looking at an issue, it might not be the greatest thing, but we are going to deal with it, right? And that's what we're talking about here. Reconciliation and dealing with contaminated sites, a lot of the same approaches we're going to be using. And, when we look at the opportunities for the Indigenous communities, we're not very far from a site in Pikwakanagan that we're going to be working very closely with CNL and others on these types of things. And what we're starting to see are really interesting opportunities, not only in the supply chain, but to take part in these activities. And especially if they have any type of traditional territory type of inclusion or any type of impact. So these things are fantastic. I'm looking forward to the discussion today and looking forward to answering any of the questions you have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right. So if I was organized, I'd be ready to go. Here we go. I think you are up next. Caitlin, can you please tell us or do your introduction for us, please?
Yeah, you bet. So my name is Caitlin Moore. I am a project manager with Public Services and Procurement Canada. I am sitting in Edmonton, Alberta, and acknowledge that I am sitting in Treaty 6 territory at the moment. I have been working on remediation projects in the Arctic for about the last 12 years, about 6 or so as a consultant in the last 6 with the federal government. This has included lots of remediation projects, lots of dew line cleanup projects, some former oil and gas sites, lots of abandoned mines across the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and some in the Yukon as well. And that's included working with Indigenous groups through all the stages of remediation, from assessment to construction. So we were asked a few questions as part of our introduction to share our thoughts with you. So the first was, how does contaminated site management fit together with reconciliation? And for me, I think that contaminated site assessment remediation work gives us the opportunity to put into place some of the TRC's 94 calls to action in some very real and tangible ways, specifically around business and reconciliation. This includes things like meaningful engagement with communities, joint decisions regarding the path forward and where those remediation projects end up. There's also some outcomes of the remediation projects which support the calls to action in a few different ways, like improving the health of the land and therefore the people that spend time on the land, as well as the development of governance agreements and things like that, specific to these projects that eventually can act as stepping stones towards creating government-to-government partnerships in other ways. Also, I know I'm going to get red carded here in a minute for time, but to me, reconciliation looks like, from my perspective as a project manager, Indigenous groups having an equitable seat at the table when it comes to planning of these remediation projects, and also having the economic capacity and labor force to undertake these construction projects occurring on their lands, and also Indigenous groups and businesses being self-sufficient and having the autonomy to develop their communities and businesses how they wish. Anyway, that's it for me. I'm good.
That's great. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you.
No, that was awesome. Thank you very much. And I skipped over Francois, so my apologies. Francois, you're up next.
I was prepared to go last, Tanya. So anyway, bonjour tout le monde. François Lauzon, Vice President for the Federal Sector Environmental Services at Stantec. I'm so happy to be here with you today. Many of you may have seen maybe too much of me over the last 4 days. As Dale, I'm here on the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe traditional territory, Ottawa. As a consultant, reconciliation to us is so important. Not just because the federal government says you have to have a percentage and an Indigenous content or whatever. To me, it's the right thing to do, but how to implement it is really our challenge in consulting, especially if I'm looking for scientists, engineers, biologists to be Indigenous and contributors to these projects. And so we talk about this workforce, we talk about bringing in elders, bringing in youth, but from a sustainability standpoint, another big word for the FICSAP program, how do we build resilience within the communities nationally so that we can have this very productive workforce of Indigenous workers that can collaborate and share on the success of the assessment and remediation of contaminated lands? So, education is important for our teams at Stantec, the non-Indigenous. We need to understand the communities we're working in, the lands, the history of that land. And so to me, that's what's important for us, is to make sure we communicate and get that education. But from the Indigenous communities, it's that sustainable workforce that is my biggest challenge that I hope we'll be able to work over the next 30 years in creating and generating. So that's it.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Francois. I appreciate it. Stanley, you're up next.
Thank you, Tanya. Well, first of all, thank you to all the participants who are listening to our panel today. I understand, as Tanya mentioned, 250 people, and what a privilege it is to have a moment of your time to share some of our thoughts and perspectives. My name is Stanley Knoll. I'm the CEO of Ross River Denny Council's group of companies, and I'm the strategic advisor and negotiator on their behalf as it relates to contaminated sites remediation and new mining initiatives in their traditional territory. Ross River Denny Council is unique in the sense, so for those of you that don't know, Ross River is in the southeast Yukon. It's its traditional territory is approximately 25% of the entire Yukon, but with very small communities. The community up until the 1950s and 60s was a very subsistence lifestyle community. In fact, during World War II was the first time that most Sakani, as they call it in Kaska language, white people first appeared in their communities. And prior to that, there was no real contact other than the odd fur trading experience prior to that in many years earlier. I have the unique position that I have both a master's degree in business and also a master's degree in social work, and have worked with Ross River 25 years ago as their executive director, and now today working on contaminated sites and remediation. To answering the questions that Caitlin spoke to, and I saw my yellow card already, which was fast, Tanya, you're stealing my time. Reconciliation, I do want to say reconciliation can't be about changing the past as it is often perceived by people. Instead, it is about all of us doing more, being better, and taking individual and collective and professional responsibility for how we do things better. And I'll leave it at that and say Francois' question of how do we do it is a question that I often encounter as recent as this morning in negotiations with a company in regards to a design project. How do we do it? I intend to share some of those thoughts with you later in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Stanley. And actually, we're up to 315 participants now, so the numbers are still climbing, which is great. Next is Keir.
Yeah, thank you. So Keir Portress, I'm the Director of Indigenous Relations for QM Environmental. Many of you have probably heard of us as Quantum Murray and we've rebranded as QM. Before that, I come from consulting, but also academia. So I have a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Victoria. I actually teach there as well in the spring. So this coming January, I'll be teaching a course called Infrastructure Engineering with Indigenous Communities. And I'm really passionate. So I'm Chinese Métis. My mom is a Chinese immigrant from Hong Kong, and my dad is a Métis person, also a foster care system survivor. And, I'm an urban Indigenous person, and, I see a lot of the work that I do really impacts Indigenous communities, and creating opportunities for those communities to be meaningfully involved with projects is really, close to my heart, because, as an Indigenous person, there aren't a lot of Indigenous people sort of, at the professional technical. And I'm sure that Francois, Tanya, everyone here on this call, and probably many of the participants watching know that. And, I often get asked the same questions. How do we get more Indigenous people, in this space? It takes work, and it takes a very long a timeline. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. So, yeah, I'm happy to share, what that looks like to me going forward in this, and really looking forward to the discussions that we're going to have.
Great, thank you, Keir. And last but not least, Rianne, you're up.
All right, thank you. Okay, so my name's Rianne Ridsdale. I'm located on Treaty 2 territory in central Manitoba. I'm a PhD candidate at X University, and I'm a board member with Canadian Brownfields Network. So since I'm an academic, I'm going to go a little high level for a moment, so please follow me until the end. So when I think about reconciliation, it's in part about admitting our past, but I'd argue it's about dismantling oppressive systems like white supremacy, racial capitalism, and settler colonialism. These are not in the past, they're ongoing, and they're purposeful systems that continuously harm Indigenous people. Indigenous scholar Leanne Simpsons points out that land dispossession is a structural force for the destruction of Indigenous bodies to remove their physical, emotional, and spiritual relationships to the land for exploitation by the state. To this day, our insatiable appetite continues to exploit Indigenous land. Climate change is a symptom of unchecked colonialism and capitalist greed, and our inability to deal with it will disproportionately affect Indigenous communities. So remediation can play a key role in restoring and returning the land in a physical, emotional, and spiritual way. It can physically, materially fix the wounds on the land. Cleaning up absolutely is a first priority, and rightly so. But there are so much more tangible outcomes when we start thinking about end uses. I posit 3 themes to consider on how to reconciliate. 1 is decolonization. 2, Indigenous collaboration. Do it to make meaningful and positive changes in which they are the drivers. 3, consider climate change mitigation within your project. I've developed 5 elements of reconciliation that can be incorporated in your project. Think of each element as a Venn diagram with contaminated sites as the center. Each project can and should hit multiple elements, and later on we'll talk about this more, hopefully. 1 is economic empowerment, 2, infrastructure investments, 3, energy sovereignty, 4, community cultural enhancements, and 5, food security. Thank you.
Thanks, Rianne. All right, well, that's a lot for everybody to start to digest, and I think all of you have done an excellent job. Thank you for introducing the topic and your feelings and your background and how that's going to inform our discussion. So we're going to jump into our prepared questions. I'm going to pair up 2 of the panel members for each question and provide them each 2 minutes to respond to the question. Then I'm going to open for 2 minutes for the other panel members to provide any responses or discussion to that. And then we're going to pop on to the next question. So we have 3, so we're going to try and keep it to time here and stimulate some good ideas and sharing. So the first question is for Caitlin and for Dale. Your question is, what are some of the key challenges in the federal procurement strategy? And how can you talk about those in the context of reconciliation and contaminated sites? I'll say, Caitlin, you can go first.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tanya. So one of the biggest challenges that we see within the communities is capacity to be able to tackle all of the facets of a remediation project. The process of engagement, technical document review, provision of technical knowledge, it's all very time consuming and requires a big team of people to undertake. And not just people, but the right people. And that's everything from environmental scientists to community members to elders and a lot of what Francois was speaking to. And all of these people need to be compensated for their time. The work that I do is for Crown Indigenous Relations in Northern Affairs Canada, and they have a mandate to increase capacity in these regards and provide funding to community groups in order to get the right people to the table to provide input and feedback into our designs and into our decisions. And I'm not sure that that's something that's always similarly prioritized across federal government groups. And developing this capacity within these individual Indigenous groups is vital to achieving that meaningful engagement and informed consent. That's such a big driver for us on these remediation projects. And from a more technical standpoint, us as project managers, we're working to maximize Indigenous involvement in our within a procurement framework that's very rigid and doesn't evolve quickly. And doesn't always allow for the optimal contracting solution that we see or that our Indigenous partners see. And our procurement teams work very hard to improve on these strategies and make these changes and right now figure out how we can best meet these needs and asks of our Indigenous partners within that current set of rules. And we've created some tools in the last few years that have allowed for that competitive contracting, which of course is the priority for the government that prioritizes local Indigenous companies.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. You're good. Dale, can I ask for your thoughts on this? Do you want me to repeat the question?
No, that's good. You can repeat it to remind everybody, but really when I look at this, I'm looking at this through the lens as the EDO of a community, okay? And so when these projects come about right from, and we're working, like I said, on a couple of projects right now, what we found worked, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that worked. And this is with CNL, AECL project that's happening not too far from Pikwakanagan. So what was key in all of that was that there was an engagement and consultation process that was really started by AECL CNL. And they came to our community, met with and we have in our community an engagement and consultation unit, went through our protocols, and then we were able to sort of ramp up and see how we could be involved in that. Now, because of the subject matter, always be aware of the subject matter, certain subject matter is going to attract political interest, right? And nuclear waste, of course, attracted political interest. So there was a political dynamic and decision that had to go along with that. We need to be aware of that, okay? What I'm getting at is there's a ramp up period that you have to be aware of and that you have to be cognizant of so that if the community is taking a little bit of time, it's because they have to go through a decision-making process. And sometimes those decision-making processes from a time perspective are incongruent with procurement and government. But you want to get a good partner on side, then you're going to need to know that there is going to be a ramp up period for their involvement. Now, once political decisions have been made and those flow down to the administration, then we have to realize too, there's a second ramp up. If you're going to want to, as others have said, get Indigenous resources onto your project, the resources you're going to be looking for are going to be, they may be difficult to find. They may be, like unicorns in some cases, right? But you're going to have to know that in order to get resources on a project, that there is a ramp up period for that too. And in some cases, you may be looking at, and if it's a long-term project, you're going to want to look and deal with the education, our education group, to find out who studied in this area. Who may we be able to position to be able to take up some of these really cool jobs you've got, right? Cleaning up stuff in a traditional territory is really what an Indigenous person is really going to get behind, right? Especially if it's something that's been in their territory that's polluted it. Anyway, awesome. It's about ramp up and it's about taking that time, okay? Just remember that there's going to be a little bit extra time. Sorry, go ahead, Tanya.
Awesome. Okay, no problem. I was going to cut you off. Thank you, Dale. I want to open it to the rest of the panel now to comment. Is there anybody else from the panel who would like to throw in some thoughts around this in discussion?
Tanya Stanley here. I can't reiterate enough of what Dale had just said about looking for the unicorns. And not only should you look for the unicorns in the First Nation organization or the opportunities, but I also think that proponents to contaminated site remediation or care and maintenance projects should look internally in their own organization for the unicorns. In every single organization, there's always people that care and have the capacity to just go that little extra step, whether it's your hydrologist who stops talking in hydrology language and starts talking to the community about, real opportunities. We need monitors. We need people to put on rubber boots and go into the creek and take samples. It's those little things of finding the champions in your own organization and then empowering them to build those relationships with the communities. And I just can't state enough, no matter what bureaucracy, no matter what layers Caitlin and her organization put in from procurement language, and no matter what you negotiate an agreement, at the end of the day, if people don't care and take the time to do it right, you'll have problems.
Kier, did you want to add in there?
Yeah, thanks, I do. Yeah, thank you. That's great, Stanley. And I think there's two things I wanted to touch on. Was Caitlin was talking about the rigidity of the procurement cycle. And I think we have to rethink that. I think that's something that everyone knows, there's a reason why it's there, but how do we rethink that, both as clients and as consultants and contractors? I've seen some really exciting stuff happen in my career that kind of goes outside of the typical procurement cycle. So, I'm happy to share that information with anyone, but, I think that's one piece. The other piece that Stanley and Dale are talking about is trying to find those unicorns, trying to identify resources, trying to find people. Urban Indigenous people are also part of that, right? So the community is one piece, but the community has, more often than not, than I've seen, they'll have more people living off reserve than living on reserve. So being able to work with their education department to look at everyone as part of their community, because lots of people want to go back to their community and work. So on these larger projects, on multi-year kind of stuff, that if you create an opportunity for somebody to go to school or use their schooling to come back to the community, that'll be, it's a win for everyone too. I think Francois, do you have something?
Sorry, Francois, did you put your hand up? We got a couple of seconds here. You can contribute, or we can wait.
I want to take seconds, and that's it. I empathize with Caitlin, who's got the PSPC handcuffs on process, and to Kier's point and Stanley's point and Dale. Like everything, it takes leadership. It's going to take a DM at PSPC, a minister that is going to take this on, this procurement that has been designed and just doesn't work right now for what we're talking about, and create a program that can be outside of the square box that currently exists, known as the PSPC procurement system. And you know, all of this is great, this conversation, but if there's not a champion at an ADM or higher level, it's going to be nothing but conversation for the next 20 years. And so my hope is that there's somebody that is serious about reconciliation in government that understand that this square box of procurement just doesn't work for increasing the Indigenous engagement and the contracting capabilities. That's my thought.
Thanks, Francois. All right, I'm going to stop the conversation there for that one and move on to our next awesome question for discussion. This one is for Keir and for Stanley. What kind of meaningful community benefits can be offered through reconciliation-focused remediation projects? And again, you each have 2 minutes, and I'm going to start with you, Stanley. Can you talk to us about your thoughts on that?
I sure can. Look, you know, building on the conversation that's already started, and again, you know, on a daily basis, we have the ability to really step outside of that box in the activities we do. So I guess another good example is going back to that hydrologist example I used earlier. You know, when you're looking at your project and trying to say, okay, what is the scope of work available that can include the community? You know, why not, instead of a hydrologist talking to other scientists, why don't you take the time, and you should take the time, to make sure you talk to the knowledge holders, to the elders, to the people in the community who have very different but often very, very important perspectives to share on the project. And you might actually find that they have solutions for your bid proposal or for your scope of work that actually makes things more efficient and less costly for the ultimate client, in often cases being government or corporations that are paying for the contaminated site cleanup. You know, going into the community question here, and Caitlin, Tanya, the time is just too short, so I'm going to keep talking until you show me the red card. I'm going to ask everybody, you know, I'm going to try to engage your audience here for a second. So bear with me, 300 people listening. Please do close your eyes. Just close your eyes for a minute, and I'm going to give you 2 scenarios. And I'm going to ask you to think about these 2 scenarios. Scenario 1, or this scenario, option 1 in this scenario. You have a company, ABC, that offers to have Indigenous people participate in the company's internal monitoring program, where they are going to go and work for the company in their head office alongside experts for a 1-year period, an internship, paid. Keep your eyes closed for a second. You've all heard this before, I'm sure, in procurements that you've prepared. Now, scenario B. The First Nation that you're working with has a small company, a small environmental company with 6 employees, and they're growing. You as a company now go to them and you offer funding support so that company can hire their own full-time person for 1 year to work for that company to help the company grow and share their skills with your team. Okay, now open your eyes for a second. Open your eyes again. I just gave you 2 scenarios that are both the exact same thing in terms of cost and in terms of ultimate end results for the benefit of your project. Scenario B provides meaningful, lasting collaboration, things that Renee talked about. It presents an opportunity for a unicorn, something Dale talked about, and it provides a real meaningful opportunity for lasting economic benefits to the community and to your project proponent, with 0 change in cost to your organizational structure and your bid project. My challenge to all of you, all 300 of you that are listening today, is to take the time to do that little bit of a deeper dig and find opportunities that leave meaningful impacts. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Stanley. All right, Keir, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And, you know, I think those 2 examples or options, I think, are things that many contractors and consultants run into every day. I think a big part of that is that procurement cycle is so I would challenge the clients and whether you're working with the clients, whoever that client is, to challenge them to actually make those connections with the local communities. Because as you build out the RFPs, as you start looking at the work packages, if you have a good relationship and a good understanding of the capabilities of the local community, of the local peoples and other Indigenous peoples and businesses in the area, it'll help you start looking at how to do procurement differently, while also being in those handcuffs, as Francois has explained, right? So I think some of the tools that PSPC has developed over the years, and most recently, like with the Indigenous Benefit Plan type stuff, they're good if they're used. But also, I think we can see where the PSAB program may be, may not be as effective as it could be, because I think it needs to be active. I think you need to know what's happening in the community and what they're doing, so that as you build out, you can still play within the requirements of your procurement, cycle, but really being meaningful about the way and the opportunities that you present to the community on their own. And then maybe the broader communities, maybe it's a hybrid model between PSAB and open procurement, and doing that type of stuff instead of just cutting a slice out, but actually taking that focused approach to say, hey, there's this many companies that can do that are Indigenous, and maybe 3 of them are in the community, right? So you hit those procurement needs, but also being able to, meaningfully connect with that relationship with those peoples.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Keir. Both Keir and Stanley, thank you. Those are some excellent points, and it's actually stimulated quite a bit of chat on the chat here, which is fantastic. Rianne, Caitlin, Dale, any thoughts on a response or additional discussion on this?
Yeah, if I
go
could.
Ahead, Caitlin. Dale's first. Okay, Dale, then Caitlin. Go ahead, Dale.
All right. On the chat, I was looking at something, and somebody suggested, and it's about timing, right? Like, I know I said about the ramp up period, it's a real thing, but somebody suggested that why couldn't they use something like ACAN, Advanced Contract Award Notice, that goes out to Indigenous communities that says, hey, look, we've got a procurement, because, you're going to know your procurement's going out. Send out ACAN to the communities that are going to be affected by the project or could be affected by the project, so that they know early. Direct ACAN. I think you've already got that in place. It's already a tool and mechanism used by PSPC. Let's think about how to use it a little differently. I like that suggestion that person put forward on the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dale. I agree. That's a great idea. Notification is always helpful in these processes. Caitlin, go ahead.
I was just going to say some of the tools that I mentioned that we've come up with in Western region for sure have allowed for some of relaxing the handcuffs, if you will, where we are directing to local Indigenous groups procurement up to $2 million in small focused batches. So it is still a competitive process, but it is to local Indigenous firms that have been pre-qualified to do this work. And that has allowed a lot of work to move from things that would have been funded under G's and C's previously, where there wouldn't have been a lot of opportunity for companies to make a profit, because that's not the intention of G's and C's. And now this work is being done under these small unbundled contracts, allowing for some of this growth that Stanley talked about, and just making that shift, I think, has been beneficial. We've gotten some really good feedback from the communities in starting to use some of these tools more and more.
That's great. Thank you very much, Caitlin. All right, I'm going to stop the discussion on that one right here. I'll go to you, Rianne, on the next one, just so we can keep moving forward, because as I thought, we're going to fill this hour really quick. We're already halfway through our panel. The final prepared question we have is for Stanley, Dale, and Keir. And I'm going to go to you, Dale, to start this one. What are some examples of reconciliation-focused developments that are currently happening? And I know I think you've mentioned one or two that are going on in your community. Can you tell us a bit about one of those projects?
Yeah, I could actually, and it's a really cool one. it's just one, the way that they're doing this project is going to make it so that we're able to cut some of that area in the ramp up period. So what we did, ACL and CNL agreed with our community to provide funding to do, along with PSPC, proficiency collection. So what we did was we went across our entire community and people that we knew that were living outside the community to find out what their education was, basically kind of resume them so we know what the skills are out there. We're also using some of that funding also to understand, some of the people that are in school and how we can stream them into certain careers that would, be available when they come out. So what was really beneficial was having some of that initial funding, number one, to participate in the project, and number two, to look at those ramp up things and really come up with some solutions. And so now what do we know? I'm sitting on a database that can tell me everything about the community members, what their educations are and what their skills are. So it's really fantastic. And that was a great part of the initial discussions with ACL, CNL, and PSPC. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dale. That's awesome. Kira, I'm going to go to you next.
Yeah, thank you. I think the one thing that comes to mind for me is being able to look at contaminated sites or old federal sites that are being negotiated within treaty. So there's a lot of communities in BC who are involved in the treaty process, and many of the lands that they're looking at are old military bases or contaminated sites. And, I think that's a great way to, say, hey, we have some leftover land from a federal perspective or provincial. Let's clean that up and give that to you through that treaty process, or give it back, repatriate it. It's not giving them their land back seems kind of backwards, right? And I think as part of that, making real commitments to remediate that land or those buildings, do that type of work in a way that the community wants it done. So if the community wants it totally cleaned up, clean it up, right? Find different pots of money or through that treaty process, ensure that it gets cleaned up, or work with them on plans to develop that land into something that they want, right? Often what I've seen both academically and professionally is their policy. Policy often gets in the way of, the projects actually finishing. And even though there might be well-meaning people on both ends of the spectrum, often it's that policy that gets in the way. So, I would encourage everyone here to, just make the commitment and move forward on it, whatever that looks like.
Great. Thank you, Kier. Awesome. Stanley, I'm going to throw it to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm going to actually diverge from all of my written notes on this one, and because I've gotten such good content from my peers on this panel. I'm actually, to be honest, Caitlin, my experience so far with both CERNAC and PSPC has actually been quite positive as it relates to the Faro mine. So all of my business development, or the majority of it, is around Ketsa remediation site or care and maintenance site, the Faro mine, which is a $2 billion 15-year project of cleaning up a contaminated site, and the care and maintenance that goes along with it. Both CERNAC and PSPC, yes, they have constraints and they're constantly changing. So that's one good thing, is that the bar seems to be, although it's small changes, if you look 10 years ago and you compare it to where we are today, it has been nothing but progressive, positive change forward. Is it going fast enough? No. Is it all, we could say all that, but the reality is my experience has been there are an incredible amount of really compassionate people who care about what they're doing and do want to change the trajectory of what's going on at the government level. On the company level, however, something that's really worked for us, that's been incredibly successful, that I'd like to encourage everyone to spend more time thinking about, especially the public servants on today's presentation. At the Faro mine, they have what's called an MCM, and I think the Giant mine is the same thing. The MCM is the main construction manager. they're the consultancy that is not able to self-perform most of the actual active work on the site. So in our case, let's assume there's $100 million worth of work. This MCM manages the $100 million worth of work. The $100 million of work is then procured out to the communities. The cuffs that bind PSPC and CERNAC are somewhat eased a little bit when the MCM goes through their own procurement process or starts to find innovative and creative ways looking for the unicorns in breaking up the work and getting it out to the communities. And that's where the relationship exists. And that's quite frankly where the opportunity exists. So I think a simple solution isn't just going to the Treasury Board and ADM levels, as many of the comments in the chat have pointed to. I think an even simpler solution is CERNAC, which they can do now. CERNAC and PSPC is making sure that their contracts, once they award a contract, allow room for the construction managers or the people that aren't able to self-perform work, allow them the room to appropriately develop, grow, and more appropriately share the work amongst the Indigenous communities as their capacity grows or as they show interest in it.
Great, thank you, Stanley. Rianne, I'm going to go to you because you had your hand up last time. I didn't get you. Can you share your thoughts with us? You're muted. There we go.
Isn't that funny? You're always like, oh, I'm never going to talk when I'm muted. I don't really have much to add, seeing as that I'm kind of an outsider when it comes to procurement and the nitty gritty details of you know, project specific sites. But I do want to highlight Stanley's example of example B that he presented. It was a different style of procurement, but the purpose behind that procurement is about economic empowerment. You're empowering that community, that community's company, or the company from a different community, but you're empowering that company to make long-lasting career choices. You're not just hiring someone for the duration of that project. You are empowering what could be a generational company. So instead of just thinking of it as project or site specific, which that is what the job is, right? You're just working on one project at a time. Try to think of it in those long-term goals outside of just the project.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. Is there anyone else from the panel who'd like to say a few words? Francois?
Yeah, maybe I want to ask a question to Stanley because he threw the MCM model out there, and I'm sure Natalie Plato from Giant said, you know, we're doing some great stuff here at Giant, and I think it's through that lens of the MCM. So I'm not an MCM expert, so full disclosure. So I'm going to guess there's targets established within that MCM model, the contract, the procurement. That MCM is going to go to a non-Indigenous firm. Let's all agree to that. How severe are the penalties for not meeting the targets? Because I know that in the past, historically, there were agreements made on contracts between the feds and non-Indigenous firms for Indigenous contributions in a percentage. The firm started the work, realized 3/4 through the project they would never meet their objectives and walked away. And now the Crown had to re-tender to finish the remediation. And that's not success in my mind. And there's got to be a real consequence for failing on that. So does anybody have a thought or an opinion on that?
I'll take the first stab. You know, Francois, you hit the nail on the head. So there has to be metric-based penalties. There has to be people in the public service that hold the MCM accountable. And in the Faro mine, I'll speak to the Faro, but I also know my colleague Paul Gruner, who works with Dayton Cho out of the Giant mine, works on the Giant mine. He's my counterpart. I'm Faro. He's Giant. We have a penalty system. There is a penalty system in place. And when we negotiated the transfer of the Faro mine from the territorial Yukon government to the feds, Canada worked very closely with us to make sure that they were holding the MCM. And at that time, it was the ICM, and now it's going to be the MCM. ICM was the interim construction manager. The MCM actually starts this coming April 1, 2022. There are penalties, and those penalties are being allocated to things that ultimately help our community. I won't get into all the specifics around it, but I'll end with this, Francois. It all comes down to people and relationships. So if there's someone in the MCM company that is championing doing things better, doing more of it, you know, my opening comments were all about doing it better and really caring about it both professionally and personally. You have to find those champions in your MCM organizations to then execute on delivering and finding those nuggets, those unicorns that Dale spoke about. You've got to find those in your execution of work and the scopes of work. And that will move the needle tremendously. It does not take, trust me, given the health, the economic capacity and the health of most Indigenous communities in Canada, we know that they are the most impoverished communities in Canada. It does not take a lot to change the needle in most communities.
Thanks, Stanley. Thanks, everybody. That was a great discussion. I've got one question here in the Q&A, and actually I'm going to throw it to Caitlin. Caitlin, the question is from Daryl Demude, and the question is, are Indigenous benefit packages or the IBPs overriding the Aboriginal business or the PSAP policy, as IBPs are more local community based?
That's a big question. So IBPs or IOC, Indigenous Opportunities Considerations, or IBPs, Inuit Benefit Plans, depending on where you are developed typically in consultation with CERNAC. Through that engagement process, we're certainly learning a lot about different communities and their different needs. We've definitely learned that what works in Nunavut definitely does not work in the Yukon, and we're having to adapt and make changes all the time. We do draw on things from PSAB or PSIB, especially around how Indigenous companies are qualified as Indigenous companies. We typically steal a lot of those definitions. However, like you mentioned, it is very much more specific with the IBP or the IOC penalties, or sorry, plans, rather than PSIB, where it's Indigenous people across Canada. With the IOCs, we can very much limit it to the community that has had the contamination or is going to should see those benefits for employment, for training, for subcontractor, supplier, things like that. This gets a little bit more complicated as we talk about the Nunavut Agreement, and that has its own set of rules around it. But I wouldn't say that it's taken over PSIB, but they somewhat, to some extent, work in harmony. And we take a lot of these things into consideration when we make these project-specific targets for our Inuit benefit plans or Indigenous Opportunities Considerations.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Caitlin. I have a question too, I guess, around, you know, I imagine there's been several iterations and thoughts around these IOCs and the plans and how to best engage Indigenous communities, especially in places where there's contaminated sites right in their community. Is it something that is constantly evolving too? Can you speak to that at all? I imagine it's changing and evolving as the needs of both the communities as well as the federal government to drive some of these sites to a place of closure. Can you speak to that a little bit, Caitlin?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we had a bit of a template, you know, that we always start from, like the last project that you worked on. Let's take that as a base model and see how that stacks up against the location and the community and the work that we're doing, the scope of the services. And I think what we found recently in the last few years is that as our level of engagement with the communities increases and becomes even more meaningful, we start engagement earlier, we get a lot more feedback. We're seeing things on a government to government level with these governance agreements and a lot more players at the table. We're finding that there are a lot more specific changes that need to be made to these IOCs to really meet the needs of the community and the needs of the people. So it's been a very interesting experience, and we're seeing some very new things on these IOCs that we haven't done before. So, you know, we're in this fantastic and kind of scary gray territory as we move forward to really do the best we can. And we don't always get it right, but we certainly do it with the best of intentions to work within those frameworks and meet the needs of those Indigenous community partners as best we can.
Yeah, great. No, that's helpful. Thank you. Kier, you got your hand up? You want to jump on this?
I think Stanley had his hand up before me.
Oh, did he? Okay.
Yeah.
I know
Thanks.
Stanley has some thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks, Kier. I just wanted to say, I noticed Tracy Daniel in the comment section made a comment about bonus points for innovative ideas and that. I'm going to say this much. And again, Caitlin, you, your team, all the way to Ottawa and Vancouver office, no matter where you're at, I've just seen nothing but people that are receptive to ideas. I think there's an incumbent role here on communities as well to take the time to educate. To be honest, I've watched PSPC folks cry in some of our meetings when they've learned some of the negative things and the impacts that have happened in our community that they just had no idea of. So it's about relationship building. It's about talking about what the problems are, but then also talking about creative and innovative solutions. I saw Lou Spagnolo commented on the 2% penalty. So thanks, Lou, for sharing that to Francois. Those are just some small examples of the many different things that I've seen PSPC and others are willing to do. The thing that we need to do now is just keep doing more of that. It's all about those relationships with Indigenous communities, with the right people, and trying to collectively move in the same direction of seeing real benefits go to the communities.
That's awesome. All right, Kier. And then Dale.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and I think those relationships are really important. And I think we all know that. I don't have to reiterate that. I think often where the challenge comes in is when you have very technical, project-oriented people trying to build those relationships. And as much as they want to build those relationships, people, I think, are generally afraid to misstep, especially in this new era of reconciliation, whatever that looks like for everyone. There's a lot of different things that are happening very quickly. It's a very fast moving things. Like every IBP that I think I've seen is very different from the next one, and all these different inclusionary things. I think they're all really great. But how do you build those relationships between those very technical project oriented people with the community when, and I see this all the time, even within our own company, where somebody will say, well, it's not in the RFP, so we can't, why would we include that, right? So I think we need a lot more people like my role on client side, on everyone's side, to be that bridge to say, hey, there are these really cool things that are happening and we can do it together, but we need to do it together, not just like, look at the contract, what it looks like. And so that bridge needs to be there. And I think that's where a lot of that work and a lot of, what Stanley and all of us are saying is there's a lot of really great people wanting and being open to that. But I think you need those intermediaries to be able to go, okay, you're saying this, you're saying that, this is what we can do to do that, instead of, taking that almost parallel approach where it never actually turns into something, or it's a lot of misses because you're missing that bridge. So I would encourage, if you don't have an Indigenous relations person fully integrated in your work or in your teams, to get one, because I think that makes a huge difference when somebody has questions, that person has enough relational experience with the project experience to reflect what the needs are.
Thank you, Kier. All right, Dale, I'm going to throw it to you. You got about a minute, and then we're actually going to have to close up because we're running out of time. Go ahead, Dale.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you now as an Indigenous business owner. The biggest thing that causes delay for an Indigenous business participation is security clearances, both individual and company security clearances. And, there's been many times where I've found unicorns, but the security clearance process, the person doesn't come to you with security clearance, or the person is has not been in the country for a while, whatever, still Indigenous, got all the requisite knowledge. But the security clearance process really is a barrier right now to a lot of participation. The second thing that's a barrier is that the Indigenous businesses knowing how to take part in these contracts. I find myself teaching Indigenous business owners more about how to get themselves ready than it is really about how to attack the project. So I just wanted to throw that out there as an Indigenous business owner.
No, that's great. Thank you, Dale. Well, that's fantastic. I'm going to wrap it up because we actually only have 6 minutes left, and I want to give each speaker, each of our panel members, a chance to just close here. So I'm actually going to go backwards from the open, and I'm going to start with you, Rianne. You got a minute to close here and provide your closing thoughts on our discussion today, and maybe some thoughts for folks to take forward from this panel discussion.
Great. I just, today we talked a lot about there's different processes and solutions out there, but we need to remember what the purpose is. And the purpose is for better engagement, empowerment, to create community cultural enhancements through projects. So we should really just remember what the purpose is of why we're here, and what we're doing is we're not trying to change the past because we can't, but we need to decolonize our future and empower people who have been historically marginalized and left out of our of the
process, and the involvement.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thanks very much. Kier, over to you. Any parting thoughts here?
Yeah, I think we need to be more active. I think that's the one thing that I think is the big thing here is, like I was saying earlier, you need to, if you don't have that bridge because you don't have those relationships, find that person who can be your bridge. They're not always going to be needed, but if they're needed right now, then that's the right thing to do.
Thanks, Kier. That's great. Stanley?
It's all about people, and it's all about relationships. It's James Cars, in case you're listening today. It's the people that take the time to do more, to be better, and to collectively and professionally be responsible for helping Indigenous communities. I just can't stress it enough. When you find the right person that cares in your organization, whether you're Stantec, Golders, Himeras, and Ceros, whatever company you are, no matter what size you are, get your people thinking as they're writing proposals, as they're executing work scopes, as they're going through their evaluation process. Get them thinking about those 3 key points that I started my comments with, which is get better at doing more, being better, and taking individual and collective responsibility for what you do in working with Indigenous communities. And if you do that, you will make enormous strides and changes for communities.
Thank you, Stanley. That's great. Caitlin, you're up. What would you like to part with?
I think thank you to everybody for sharing on this panel. I've learned a lot. I've got a lot of notes to take away. I'm sort of constantly humbled by the amount of great ideas out there. And, as the federal government, we want to do better. There are a lot of really passionate people in this organization, and we want to do the best we can for the communities, and I'm just so glad to have been a part of this panel and be able to share some thoughts with you and take this information back to my organization.
Thank you, Caitlin. That's awesome. Francois, parting thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. The fact that we have 330 people still in a virtual conference on a 4th day speaks volumes to the importance of this issue. I think it's, and it's been said, the federal government, to Caitlin's point, like everybody wants to do what is right. And I don't disagree with that. And my point will always be, it's going to take leadership, thought leadership. And I'm going to go to a statement that Rianne did during one of her talks this afternoon. I cringed, but she said, make sure you have social scientists on your team because engineers aren't going to do it. And I said, what? I'm an engineer. But anyway, but she's right. It's going to take all kinds of different experts and Indigenous experts and social experts and engineers and scientists to make this work. So build your teams around that expertise. Be aware of your blind spots. Be aware of that unconscious bias because there's a lot of history from the past that people are dragging along in their jobs. We have to learn, we have to educate ourselves and be aware of that. That's it.
Thanks, Francois. And Dale, close us out.
All right, thank you so much. What I want to do is I want to encourage the government employees, the federal, the provincial employees that are there, okay? Like 30 years ago, this doesn't even happen. This discussion doesn't even happen, but it's happening now. And we've gone through a period of recognizing reconciliation and recognizing some of the things that happened in our communities. Every child matters and things like that. I want to encourage you, because I am seeing change, communities are seeing change too, to keep moving the needle, okay? It's going to be painful. It's going to be hard sometimes. You're going to be speaking truth to power, and that's always fun. So when you're doing that, though, know at the end of the day that the community that you're doing for, that you're going to be doing it for, is going to benefit, all right? Keep going. Keep going. I know it's hard, but we're starting to see results. And you know what? You get these other countries commenting about Canada and all the stuff that, you know, we've got. Give us our chance. We're going to make this right, okay? And you know what? At the end of the day, as my colleagues have said, building the relationships is going to help you, right? Because if we're on your team also, and we're briefing up or we're trying to get something, it's better to have us both working together than working apart, right? So thank you so much. Frankie, thank you for inviting me, buddy. I'm really happy with this. And I'm going to be telling my chief and council on all you guys, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. And thank you again to all the panelists for the discussion today. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for all of your great insights and thoughts. Really appreciate your time. Hope all of you who have been listening and participating in the chat have enjoyed and learned a lot today. And thanks again for participating in the workshop. And we're done for today in this panel. So have a wonderful rest of your afternoon and evening, and be safe wherever you are. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for hosting, Tanya.
Thanks.
Great panel. Thank you, everybody.
See you later.
Thank you.